Okay, welcome to episode 25 of The State of Mirrorless. Today, my guest is calling us from exactly where are you traveling to Yellowstone Park?
Yeah, I was recently in Yellowstone, and now I'm taking one night over in Missoula, Montana, before I go up to Glacier National Park in Montana.
So Ian Norman, I got to know him through his work with night photography, astrophotography in general. I've always aspired to take great night pictures of the Milky Way and so on. Unfortunately, I live in an area where light pollution is almost inescapable. I need to travel very far to get clear skies. But I've done my little bit of attempts at night photography and night skies photography. And I found that Ian Norman's website, lonelyspec.com, has a great resource for that kind of photography. So when I learned that Ian was using mirrorless cameras for his work, I, of course, wanted to interview him for our series. And so he graciously accepted. And now he's here. And so welcome, Ian. And
thank you.
Would you like to introduce yourself for our audience?
I guess my name's Ian Norman. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a photographer, blogger, and I like to call myself a full-time traveler. My girlfriend Diana and I have been traveling full-time for about a year and a half now. We both quit our jobs and have been focusing solely on photography and just trying to write great content on the internet on our blogs.
Great. While we are speaking, I will just put up on the screen some of your photos so people who don't know you can have an idea of what kind of photography you do.
Yeah, sure. Let's see.
Okay, I think this is working. So this is a Milky Way picture, and of course, what I mentioned is that you are now shooting with mirrorless systems, and
right.
You not only take great night photography, but as I said, you provide a great resource for everyone who wants to take night photography. And especially I was a big estimator of your guide to what are the best lenses for night photography and for Milky Way photography in particular. And you have a wealth of information about those about that issues, because it's there are some technical issues involved in taking those pictures. Would you like to explain a bit what are the qualities that make equipment ideal for taking those kind of photos?
So when we're shooting night photography, the conditions are about as poor as you can get, I suppose, for a camera. A camera is a device that's really meant to capture light. And when we're talking about trying to capture the Milky Way, it's an extremely dim object in the sky. So there's a number of different things that affect the result that we're going to get from a camera. And some of those traits, the most important traits are in the choice of lens, essentially. So in order to capture as much light as possible, we want to make sure that we have a lens that has a relatively large aperture. So we're looking for lenses with low f numbers. And one of the other things to keep in mind, especially with this type of photography where we have a landscape and like the full view of the Milky Way in there, is to make sure that we have a wide angle lens. So the combination between a wide angle lens that also has a large aperture is sort of the sweet spot for this type of astrophotography, or landscape astrophotography, as a lot of photographers like to call it.
In terms of exposure data, I know that there are some things that you have to keep in mind. And people, when I did share my photos, my Milky Way photos online, people would ask me what aperture did you use, what time did you use, what was the ISO, and so on. And
right.
There are some, let's say, rules that you have to follow in order to get the best.
I think that's one of the things I really like a lot about this type of astrophotography, especially, is that it's pretty accessible in the fact that you literally can just use a formula to figure out your settings. As long as you've sort of at least done the initial steps to set yourself up for a good photograph. You know, you've scouted a cool location for your landscapes, or and traveled out to a location that doesn't have as much light pollution. As long as you've done those first steps, the rest of the practice is just plugging in the right settings. And you know, as far as the exposure triangle goes, of course, we have our shutter speed and our f number and the ISO, and each of those can sort of be calculated, essentially, like what the best combination of each of those for night photography is. And one of the most important in terms of how it'll affect the look of the image is the shutter speed. And the shutter speed needs to be in sort of this happy medium between being a fairly long exposure, so that we can capture as much light as possible, you know, to really kind of burn in the brightness of the stars and try to pick out all of the faint details in the Milky Way. But it also can't be so long that the rotation of the Earth actually starts to blur the stars, which is what most astrophotographers will call star trailing. And star trailing can be desirable for its, you know, a certain effect if you want to show the movement of the Earth in there. But in order to capture these, you know, really fine pinpoint stars, the shutter speed needs to be short enough so that you don't see any of that motion. And there's a special formula that most photographers use. It varies depending on who you talk to. I like to use what is called the 500 rule. And the 500 rule is as simple as taking the number 500 and dividing it by the focal length of your lens. So just as an example, if you're shooting on a 50mm lens, 500 divided by 50 gives you 10, and 10 seconds is roughly the maximum exposure length that you would want to use with a 50mm lens. And that of course is the 35mm full frame equivalent.
Yeah, and that is the reason why wide angle lenses are probably advisable for this kind of photography. One, because you can get more of the sky in the picture, because the objects like the Milky Way are huge. They fill up much of the sky. Right? And two, because they allow you to use longer shutter speeds. If you have a 50mm lens, you are limited to a 10-second exposure.
Only 10 seconds.
If you have a 25mm lens, you can use a 20-second exposure, and so that will give you twice the light and brighter stars or more stars in the picture.
Right. Yeah, I primarily shoot with a 24mm equivalent lens. That's sort of my favorite. So like Fujifilm recently released their 16mm f1.4 lens. I'm really excited to try that lens out. And in terms of full frame, I've stuck with one lens for like my entire career of astrophotography, and that's a 24mm f1.4. made by Rokinon or Samyang, which is another name of the same manufacturer.
And in terms of aperture, you tend to use the widest aperture possible, or sometimes
yeah, that's
top down.
Usually what I recommend on my website is, especially for somebody starting out, use the lowest f number you can for the widest aperture. That way we're collecting as much light. There are some reasons to start to stop down, but in general, for a beginner just starting out, I always recommend, just shoot at the lowest f number that your lens can go, zoom all the way out, and that'll usually give you the best results. In terms of fine detail and kind of learning the lenses, certain lenses will start to become a little bit sharper and maybe will reduce aberrations in the corner of the image if you stop down a little. So for example, with my 24mm 1.4, I really like stopping down to f2 just so I have nice pinpoint stars in the image.
Cool. And what about ISO?
So ISO is actually an interesting topic because the methodology that we'd use is a little bit more complex than the other forms of the exposure triangle, because different camera manufacturers have different methods of amplification on their cameras. So the guidelines for any given camera are actually different. So if you're using a Canon camera versus using a Sony camera or a Nikon camera, you would use the Canon camera a little bit differently than you would the Nikon camera to get the very best results. But if I was just telling a beginner to start out, like on my How to Photograph the Milky Way article on lonelyspec.com, I would generally say to start at ISO 1600 or higher. And I generally shoot between ISO 1600 and about ISO 6400. That tends to be the sweet spot where the camera is boosting the signal enough for the finest detail and also giving you, a relatively good noise profile. And something that I think is actually interesting, and it's a little bit of a misconception when it comes to ISO, is that the higher ISOs can actually sometimes give you cleaner images, especially in types of photography where you're light limited, where you're really having to rely on a long exposure like astrophotography. Using a higher ISO is actually a pretty good thing. I get a lot of beginners approach me with their early results, and they're wondering why their image is so noisy or why it's so dark, and it's usually because they've shot their photographs at ISO 200 or ISO 400, and if they had just bumped it up a little bit to ISO 1600, it would have helped a lot.
All right. While we are speaking, I'm keeping on showing your photos, and this is the base technique, right? Get your exposure triangle right.
Right.
Of course, you need to use a tripod, and of course, it's better to use a remote controller to avoid any form of camera vibration or movement, but that's pretty obvious. I think what comes next is the artistic part of the equation. I mean,
right.
The Milky Way or the night sky can be beautiful, but once you've seen one Milky Way picture, if it's only the Milky Way in the picture, they all tend to look pretty much the same.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So the part of the sky that you see in a Milky Way shot, like the one that we're showing here, is the galactic center. And in terms of like our astronomical timeline, the galactic center doesn't change. It's basically the same all the time. So shooting a Milky Way photograph is sort of like shooting a sunset. Your subject is the same, or this element of your photograph is always the same. It's, the sun is the sun, and the Milky Way is the Milky Way. So the next element to it is definitely trying to go out somewhere unique to capture it, and usually those things go hand in hand. The Milky Way can only really be successfully captured in fairly dark locations, at least to a degree of quality, that I would hold for my work, and and with that come pretty interesting places. This photograph in particular is shot from Trona Pinnacles, California, which is, I would say, still is by far my favorite location for astrophotography. It's a set of about 200 tufa spires. I think they're made out of like calcium carbonate or something. It's basically the remnants of an ancient lake, and with 200 different like monolithic structures to roam around at night, it's just sort of like a treasure trove for composition. There's just a million different things that you can try. And I think, like with a lot of photography, it's one of those things that you just need to go out and sort of experiment with. And I'll go out one night and I'll shoot hundreds of photographs and ultimately only pick maybe one or two. And so there's a lot of trial and error involved, especially when you're roaming around at night. You can't see very well what's on the LCD, so composition's a little bit more difficult. It's definitely a kind of a trial and error process. You gotta try it out a couple times to sort of get the hang of it.
So you would definitely say that it's important to have some kind of foreground interest object.
Yeah, absolutely. In general, I think that's one of the things that I've really grown to love about these types of photographs is the sense of perspective that it gives you. It sort of puts things into scale, if you will, on a galactic level, I suppose. So picking anything that can rise above the horizon, I think, is a really important element to most of the photography that I like to do at night.
In the case of this picture, where does the light on the rocks come from?
That's actually a good question. So Trona Pinnacles, while it is sort of in the middle of the desert, like in the middle of nowhere, there's actually an industrial chemical plant nearby this location in the town of Trona, California. And Trona is a very, very small town. It has, it must have a population of only several hundred people, maybe 1,000 people in it. But even then, the lights from this chemical plant and from the town actually spill over onto the pinnacles. And there's almost no getting away from it. The lights are just directly line of sight to the pinnacle. So they always have sort of an orange glow from the sodium vapor lamps of the chemical plant. And and the lights that you actually, or the orange glow that you see on the horizon is from an adjacent town that's almost 100 miles away, which is the town of Barstow, California. And even it being 100 miles away, like over the horizon, it still creates a really prominent orange glow.
So in this case, you are thankful for light pollution,
Yeah, it's sort of, light pollution becomes sort of like a love-hate thing, I suppose. To low degrees of light pollution, it can be kind of an interesting thing. It's sort of like your own, I don't know, personal, light, I guess, lighting up your scene. But other times it can look really unnatural, and of course, if it's too intense, it's just going to block out all of the detail in the Milky Way. So I think it's one of those things that I don't mind when there's sort of friendly balance, but for the most part, I'd say that light pollution is generally an enemy to astrophotographers.
Yeah. One last important thing that I learned, and I learned it sort of the hard way. When I was in Utah last year, I went to Arches National Park. I stayed there as the darkness fell. Stayed there at night, and I took some night shots. And I thought to myself, why can I not see the Milky Way? Because it was a very dark night. It was crisp. There wasn't no humidity in the air, and so on. I couldn't even see the lights of Moab in the distance. And I said, oh, I still can't see the Milky Way.
Right.
And the reason why I couldn't was that was in March. So you cannot always see the Milky Way. There is a time of the year.
That's something that that took me a while to realize too. When I was first learning, I started out and it was sort of like, okay, it's nighttime. Where's the Milky Way? And it's funny because the Milky Way actually has seasons, and those seasons are directly aligned with our year calendar. And the Milky Way tends to be the most visible during the summer solstice. So right around this time of year, like June, July, is the prime time for being able to see this bright portion of the galactic center. And during the turn of the year, so from December through about March, the Milky Way, the Milky Way is sort of in its like, I don't know, I would call it its dormant state. It's not actually doing anything different. It's just obscured by the sun. So the galactic center ends up only being out during the daytime, and of course we can't see any stars during the daytime during that time of year. So the best times to shoot generally start in April, I guess. And in April, the Milky Way only rises above the horizon in the very early morning hours. And as the year progresses, when we get into May, June, and July, the Milky Way will start to rise earlier and earlier in the night. And by the time we get to the end of June, the Milky Way will be in the sky for almost the entire duration of the night. And the galactic center, this bright part that you see, it's visible from almost every part of the world except for the most northerly latitudes. So once we start getting closer to the Arctic Circle, it starts to become less and less visible just because it starts to dip below the horizon. And for that reason, the southern hemisphere tends to be the best location in terms of visibility to see this bright portion of the Milky Way. I personally haven't been able to shoot the Milky Way in the southern hemisphere yet, but that's kind of on my bucket list. I plan on going to New Zealand sometime, either later this year or early next year, hopefully to shoot it.
That might explain why I've never seen photos of the Milky Way, the galactic center in Iceland, for instance. That would be an awesome picture,
right.
Like one of those waterfalls with the Milky Way in the background, but you cannot. You just
right, yeah. And, I mean, obviously, when you're taking a photograph of the stars, you're technically taking a picture of the Milky Way. I mean, everything that we see in the night sky, every single star is part of the Milky Way. But yeah, you're really looking for that sort of the bright core of the galaxy. But there's a lot of cool things that can be found on along the plane of the Milky Way. They might not be as bright, but you'll usually get like a denser bunch of stars in those areas. So at least trying to find the galactic plane is pretty important. And that's usually what you have to default to when you shoot in the higher latitudes, like near Iceland. So you end up seeing maybe a whole bunch of stars, but not that really bright, detailed core.
Yeah, you mentioned finding the galactic plane. Do you use any apps or resources for
yeah,
finding
actually. So there's a couple of different apps. I'm currently using an Android phone, and the the best app that I found for Android is called Stellarium Mobile. It's sort of like like a mashup between Stellar and Planetarium, so Stellarium. And Stellarium's pretty cool. It basically gives us a real-time view of what the Milky Way looks like at any given time of night, and then we can also enable like the accelerometer to view in real time like what direction the Milky Way is depending on where we're pointing our phone. Another really great app that is available. Excuse me. Let me get a drink of water here.
Sure.
So another really great app that's available for iOS is called Sky Guide, and Sky Guide has a really, really detailed image of the Milky Way, and it also lets you use the accelerometer of the camera so that you can just sort of point it in the direction that you're facing to figure out where the night sky is. It makes it really, really easy. I mean, you could figure out where the Milky Way was during the daytime or in really heavy light pollution, like in the middle of a city. So you don't necessarily need to be able to see it with your own eyes to find it, which is really nice, especially when you're trying to set up your composition ahead of time. I think it's really important when you're going out to maybe an unfamiliar in the pitch black to scout it during the day. So I'll usually try to make sure I arrive at least midday, kind of walk around the area, figure out where my compositions will be. And while I'm doing that, I have my app open to help me determine where the Milky Way is going to rise in the sky by the time that it gets dark. That way I'm ready to line up the positions of my foreground details with the Milky Way in the background.
Okay. So our show is about gear, is about mirrorless cameras. So we'll just maybe briefly mention the kind of the equipment that you use. You already mentioned lenses, but we might want to talk a bit about camera bodies and the fact that you are nowadays shooting with mirrorless cameras. Are they as good as traditional DSLRs for this kind of photography? What do you find that is good about them? Maybe what do you find that is not so good about them?
Yeah. As far as being as good, I have absolutely no reservations saying that mirrorless cameras are better than DSLRs, especially for night photography. There's one particular camera that stands out of the pack from pretty much any other camera available on the market, and that's the Sony A7S. The Sony A7S has such a high level sensitivity on its sensor that you can focus and compose your image entirely in real time on the viewfinder. You can see the Milky Way in real time on the viewfinder, and that alone makes it just significantly better for night photography than pretty much any other camera I've ever used. Now that's sort of on the user experience side. It's definitely the easiest. In terms of image quality, I think that mirrorless cameras are basically on par with what you would find in any given DSLR. And that's just sort of dependent on the sensor size and the system. I think everything is basically comparable. So if you're sort of cross-comparing an APS-C mirrorless camera with an APS-C DSLR, you're going to expect essentially the same results. One of the things that I really like in particular is the Sony sensors. So the sensor in the A7 Mark II, for instance, which I have right now, and that's what this image was taken with, it has some really great capability for retaining shadow detail. So like this image was actually shot on a really slow lens. It was shot on an f4.5 lens, which in terms of astrophotography is usually not recommended. But even at f4.5, I was able to shoot at ISO 1600, and I think it was probably a 20-second or 30-second exposure. And it could still pick out a lot of the detail, on the floor of the sand dunes here in this picture. So that's one of the things that I've really grown to love from using Sony cameras in particular. The Fujifilm X-T1, which is also another camera that I use, has a Sony sensor, and that's one of it has the base sensor is a Sony sensor, and it has its own Fujifilm color filter array on it, and I think that having at least that base Sony sensor technology in there is one of the things that has really made it an excellent camera.
I think one of the things that people need to know about this kind of photography is that nowadays you can get great results, excellent results with equipment that is not top of the line. I mean, you don't need a $5,000 camera to take this kind of pictures. You can take them with a $1,000 camera. And I've taken some of my Milky Way pictures with the Samyang 12mm f2 lens on my Fuji bodies, and that lens cost me about $350.
Right.
It gives excellent results. So you can really do that with I would not say cheap equipment. Probably better not to use a compact point and shoot camera, but with even a entry level DSLR or mirrorless cameras, you can get excellent results.
Right. Yeah, and that actually is a point I sort of wanted to make in this interview. So there are actually I think a couple pictures that I included that were made on the Sony RX100, which is a point and shoot. I'm sorry, the Sony RX100 Mark III, which is a 1-inch sensor, point and shoot. I mean, it sort of blurs the lines between point and shoot and mirrorless. Let's see if we can find that image. It's one of Trona Pinnacles, again, with the vertical spires. Keep going. This image right here, and this one. Yeah, so both of these images were actually made on a point and shoot camera. And I think that that's sort of a testament to how technology is progressing. Now, the RX100 Mark III is not a particularly cheap camera. I think it's on the order of $700 or $800, but it's an all-in-one package. It has a really great fast lens already attached to it. It's really compact. It has all the perks of a full-size mirrorless camera, but it fits in your pocket, and I think that's one of the really cool things. And one of the things that I've always tried to communicate on Lonely Spec is that you don't need a really big, you don't have to have a full frame DSLR to do this type of stuff. There's a lot of really great technology out there, and the mirrorless camera market is really pushing the bounds of what can be done in a really tiny package. I would say that the RX100 is probably one of the cheaper packages that you could get if you wanted to start some really excellent astrophotography on a budget. And some of the other cameras like this, the A6000 is, I mean, it's gotten really cheap, I think, online, and that's that camera alone is kind of a workhorse. I really enjoyed my time using the A6000, and so it combined with a fast lens like that Rokinon 12mm makes for just a really compact, low light shooter. So
I think the RX100, yeah, you call it a point and shoot, but it's actually a quite very capable camera.
yeah, it's sort of like it's like a
1-inch
sleeper.
sensor, if I'm correct. The size of the sensor is 1 inch.
Yeah, it's a 1 inch.
Yeah,
Yeah,
probably. And yeah, it's a point and shoot in terms of the size. It's very pocketable and so on, and
right.
it's quite advanced. They pack a lot of technology in that small package.
Right. Yeah. But
Okay.
yeah, I definitely like to encourage people, regardless of their equipment. You know, if all you have is, you know, like a 5-year-old DSLR with a kit lens, that isn't a reason to not try astrophotography. It's still possible. Your results might not be as good as the guy with, you know, the full frame camera, but you know, some of the smaller sensors can still, you know, capture the Milky Way just fine.
All right. We've been talking a lot about night photography and the Milky Way, and people might start thinking that you only go out to shoot at night and you don't do anything else but sleeping during the day. But I was really pleased to discover that you do a lot of other photography as well. And I'm just going to share my screen again and show some of your other pictures. You also have this other website. You have lonelyspec.com, which is all about night photography. And you also have photoncollective.com, where you can you talk a bit about your other photography?
Yeah, so I have been concentrating on Lonely Spec for a while and just sort of talking about night photography online. So my online presence was sort of just purely the nighttime stuff. But I do have a life during the day, and I do like to take a lot of portraits during the day, and as well as daytime landscapes. And one of the things that I really like to do is kind of see how I can kind of push the bounds of what I can do with my equipment to create something surreal. And I think that sort of pushes into where Photon Collective is going in terms of a website is how creative can you be with your photography? You know, what are fun, creative projects that you can do with your photography? So Photon Collective has become sort of a place where I can talk about the other things that I'm doing during the day. This series of photographs is from the creation of a levitation photography tutorial that I have on photoncollective.com. I spent a month in Mexico City, and we met a whole bunch of people there and a lot of new friends, and they were all kind enough to let me photograph them for this project. Now, so these photographs were all made with, you know, relatively simple gear. In terms of doing the levitation trick, it's basically they're just supported by a kitchen stool, like a little plastic kitchen stool, and then that's later photoshopped out. So in terms of technical difficulty, it's just a little bit of post-process learning. But some of the other things that I like to do, like something that's apparent in this photograph is it's actually a combination between several exposures. So I have a very long exposure in there, like a 2-second exposure where the traffic is moving by and gives you kind of the motion blur effect. And then that combined with the standard fast exposure for the portrait makes for kind of this surreal look. And that's just what I was going for, like trying to create something a little bit magical, I guess. I think one of the things that any photography could tell you is that if you want to shoot for the best results, just shoot during the end of the day, or wake up early and shoot during sunset. And that's one of the things that I like to make sure I do with all of these, making sure that the model's in a in a shaded area, so all of the light on them is relatively soft, and it sort of acts like its own softbox. That's a really simple trick for making soft light on a person without the use of like a scrim or any kind of big heavy equipment. I traveled to Mexico with just the A7 Mark II and a 35 millimeter lens, the tiny. Let me get it here. So yeah, I basically had just this little camera with me for 2 months of traveling abroad. I was in Costa Rica and Mexico, and this is basically all I had with me, this and a tripod. And even with like this limited gear, I think it really made for an interesting exercise in sort of working with a minimalist camera setup and just sort of working within the constraints of your equipment, not having a zoom lens and being able to sort of get used to that focal perspective. I think it turned out pretty well. I got a lot of really great photographs on that trip in particular.
And then you got the paper cranes in the photo somehow. I don't want.
Yeah, somehow. So the paper cranes, the method is the same. So all of these images are about combining data from multiple images. So the paper crane is the same paper crane that you see. Like every single one of them is the same paper crane, and it is duplicated by holding it up on a stick. I had like a little wooden stick, and I had a friend just move the paper crane around the scene, one photograph at a time. So as soon as they heard the shutter click, they would move it to a new position, and I would click the shutter again. And eventually I had 100 frames or so of paper cranes all over the place, and it was just a matter of picking and choosing which crane complemented the image the most, and adding that in, and then moving on to the next layer, seeing if I liked the next paper crane, and then adding it into the image as well. So it's a whole bunch of layers of compositing necessary for this type of photograph. But it's a pretty fun exercise, and I think the result is...
I would call the result very, very creative.
Yeah, thank you.
That's great. And it totally looks natural, like the paper cranes are really there in the picture, the light and
it's
interesting
it's interesting what you can achieve with a tripod. As long as you're like not, you set the camera to manual mode so that your exposure doesn't change, and just don't adjust your focus, don't adjust your viewpoint, and you can end up combining a whole bunch of different images into this kind of cool final composite.
All right, I'm just showing a bit more. It's more natural portrait in the sand dunes and so on. But our time is running a bit short, so I'm just going to say thank you for being with us today. It's been really enlightening what you can do with today's equipment to create some really unusual images and creative ones. It's important. I think this is a very important message that people can extract from this conversation, is that you don't need a big production, big equipment to create those kind of results. It's something that is really achievable by anyone who has the motivation and just a little bit of technical knowledge and skills. And then it all comes down to getting the right ideas and practicing, I guess. Would you agree?
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that if anything, something that I've learned and something that I kind of hold to heart in a lot of my photography is that simpler tends to be better, and that ranges from everything from your composition to your equipment. So the artistic side of it, I think simplicity definitely helps. You know, I mean, that's the whole idea of a photo, is that you're using this frame to crop out something. You're simplifying the scene. You're getting rid of everything outside of the frame. And then that also applies on the equipment side when you're setting out to go somewhere and your goal is to take photos. If you're lugging around a huge bag with, you know, 2 DSLR bodies and 6 lenses and, you know, battery packs and all that stuff, it ends up sort of detracting from the experience of being where you are and of the actual making of the image. And I think when you sort of constrain yourself to this small device and you know, maybe have just a prime lens, it's kind of amazing what you end up doing when you have to work around a simpler setup. And I think that that's one of the things that I've really come to love with using these really small mirrorless cameras, is just how simple of and compact a setup that you can create.
So what's coming up next for you? Any new projects that you are thinking of? Any new creative directions that you are moving into? What can people expect?
I'm always looking for technical challenges, I suppose. A few of the things that I've delved into recently and some of the articles that I've published on Photon Collective have dealt a lot with computational photography and sort of combining multiple images a little bit differently from those kind of magic reel levitation portraits that I was doing, but sort of trying to work with I guess large data sets, and by doing that creating either extremely high resolution images or creating photographs that with really how would you say, I guess, really poor cameras that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. So one of the most recent articles that I had worked on was photographing the Milky Way with a cell phone. And that's sort of like what I've been experimenting with is, you know, how low can you go? You know, what's the cheapest equipment that you can use to create any given image? Right now, I'm actually I actually have this. I'm looking at kind of adapted and affordable glass for my camera, and seeing what I can do with as, I guess, cheap of a lens as I can work with. So one of the lenses I'm currently using is the new actually Canon 50mm 1.8. It's basically just a rehash of their old 50mm. It's $100 online, really, really cheap. But you know, on a mirrorless setup, you can adapt it to pretty much anything, and or you can adapt pretty much any lens to a mirrorless setup. So I figured I'd try it out on the Sony with an adapter and see what it can do. You know, what $100 lens can do. So I've been using that for astrophotography, landscape photography, portraiture. You know, I just sort of want to write an article about doing more with less, I suppose.
Okay, great. Where can people go to find you?
Let's see. Everybody can go to lonelyspec.com. That's where you'll find all of my night photography and astrophotography tips, tutorials, some inspiration on there. I've got video tutorials and gear reviews. And my new website is called photoncollective.com. That one just started recently, and it's all about creative photography. So one of my most popular articles on that right now is my levitation photography tutorial. You can go there and check that out. I also have an online class featured on that site, which includes like a full video walkthrough of doing the levitation portraiture and processing and everything. And I'm also on Instagram. My username is iNorman. You can follow me there. I update that. I've been updating it almost every day for the last few weeks as we travel through the US. We're currently on a road trip. And yeah, that's
Is that
where you can
mobile
find me.
photography, or do you take photos with digital
It's
camera?
actually a combination of both. Yeah, I like to use the Wi-Fi function on the A7 Mark II to transfer my images to my phone so I can post them to Instagram. But I also have quite a few. But I also have quite a few photographs of my travels, just using my cell phone, including some of the Milky Way, just using the cell phone.
Great. I'm sure it will be. I will check out that account, and I'm sure people will do as well. So we will put links to those sites in the blog post that will accompany the video. And so I would like to thank you again for this time of you, and would like to wish you all the best for your next projects and travels. Take care. Goodbye.
Yeah, you too. Take care.